Hey, I'm Lana from Lana Glowshot Art, and in this video, we'll be unboxing the February 2024 Sketchbox. This is a true mixed media box with a bunch of supplies that will help you explore color mixing, mark making, and so much more. Ready? Let's get into it. The surface in this month's box is the Benfeng watercolor paper. This is a 140-pound cold press heavyweight paper, and the surface is great for painting and drawing materials. The first drawing materials in our box are the Staedtler triangular pencils in green and brown. I'm swatching the green colored pencil, and as I do that, I'm building up the color in layers. I'm moving in a variety of different directions, and I'm keeping my colored pencil really sharp. This allows me to get into the texture of the paper, and it also allows me to build up really even coverage without damaging the tooth of the paper, which can be really important for a mixed media approach. For a gradation of color, you're gonna play around with your pressure. Start heavy and then release the pressure as you go. Continue to work in a variety of different directions. These pencils are great for a softer approach or a sketchier approach, but we also have the Zebra Sarasa fine liner in black, which is going to be great for a more concrete line and more aggressive mark making. When you're building up value with this pen, I definitely recommend cross-hatching. Go in a variety of different directions. Pressing harder on the pen is not going to yield a darker mark necessarily like it will with the colored pencil, but with a careful approach, you can build up the thickness of your lines. To get started with these drawing supplies, let's start with a simple still life. Look around your space. Is there something fun that you could draw? I am drawing a potted plant that was on my desk, and the pot is a basic cylinder, so I start with ellipses that I connect with straight vertical lines. Ellipses are hard to draw, and that's exactly why I'm starting with the lightest drawing material in this set, the green colored pencil. I'm drawing very lightly and using this to just lay in the structure. And when I'm drawing the leaves, I'm not worried about getting every single detail or the curve of every leaf perfect. I'm more interested in relationships. I'm using the brown colored pencil as well to help me really look at the negative space, and this gives me another chance to refine the leaves and the relationships. Each layer I am continuing to draw. I'm not tracing, but I'm looking at what my first impression was, and I'm editing and refining. Sometimes it can be really helpful to put yourself in the frame of mind like you're editing somebody else's work. This is somebody else's first draft, and you're coming in and you are giving them feedback. And I like that mindset when I'm using something really permanent like the Sarasa fine liner. Having the initial layer with colored pencils that's really light gives you an idea of where you're going, so you can come in with a lot of confidence with the fine liner. You can also play around with texture and mark making, and even using some marks to show the three-dimensionality of different items in your drawing. Because the colored pencil is so light, you don't even have to worry about erasing it. It's kind of fun to show the history of the drawing in your final product. Next up, we have the Jacquard High Tones Liquid Watercolor, which is a dye-based watercolor in leaf green and violet. We also have the Schmincke Aqua Drop, which is a pigment-based liquid watercolor. And we'll apply these liquid watercolors with the Winsor Newton size 4 bamboo brush. This paintbrush comes really hard. It's coated in gum arabic, and if you just bend it and crunch it, you can start painting with it, but you run the risk of damaging the bristles. Instead, I recommend that you continue to soak your bristles in water and then gently manipulate them with your fingers, and repeat this process until your bristles are soft enough and ready to paint with. A dry brush doesn't hold a ton of this pigment, but you'll notice right away how bright and vibrant violet is. Oh my goodness, we are working with some really beautiful colors. When you wet the brush, you can hold a lot more paint. And I'm going to create a gradation here by adding the pure paint first and adding more water as I go. This bamboo brush allows you to create a variety of different lines, and this is a calligraphy brush. So hold it in different ways, play around with different marks you can make. Use the top of the brush, the side of the brush, the point of the brush, and explore a variety of different marks. Next up, I'm swatching the leaf green, and my paintbrush is wet this time, so I'm able to hold more watercolor in my brush, and I'm able to move it around a little bit easier. After creating the gradation, I'm playing around with different marks. I really liked this leaf that I was able to create with 2 strokes. See if you can do it too. Next, I'm swatching the magenta. This is an incredibly bright, incredibly intense color that holds its vibrancy even when you dilute it with water. This will be a really fun color to play around with, exploring this month's prompt, which is fantasy. For the next exercise, I want you to wet a section of your paper and really get a lot of water on there. Now, drop your watercolors into the water. Use really concentrated paint, so don't water it down first, and allow the paints to mix. So maybe you pick up a color and drop it right on top of another color. Allow the colors to move around naturally on their own, and then just see what you end up with. If you end up with something you really like, you might enjoy drawing on top of it with your fine liner after it's dry. Play around with mixing magenta and leaf green together to create a really nice sepia tone. You can also play around with the proportions and get a really nice earthy green. Here I'm sprinkling some table salt into the wet paint, and then I'm going to let it dry completely on its own. You can also drop water onto already dry paint to reactivate it and then pull it up with a paper towel. This is how I created bubbles later on in another piece. You can also use really wet paint on top of a dry layer to reactivate it and for the colors to mix. And you'll see this really interesting texture that's created after the paint is dry. The last product in this box is the Jacquard Bleed Proof White, which is perfect for creating highlights and tints. This white paint is incredibly thick, so I recommend using a craft stick or another tool to remove it from the pot, and then using your brush to mix in the liquid watercolors. You can create a wide variety of tints by adding more white as you continue to mix in your color. You'll notice that the addition of this thick paint does change the consistency of your liquid watercolors quite a bit, so I would recommend exploring some of those techniques you've been using again with the addition of white and see how they go before you put them in your final piece. I want you to try this creative exercise by mixing up a variety of different washes and laying out some abstract shapes on your piece of paper. You want to make sure there's plenty of water in these and that you allow them to dry completely before you look at them and then turn them into actual objects. When you look at your shapes, you might have no idea what to turn them into, and this is where the creativity and imagination part of this exercise really comes in. This is going to push your brain to come up with a creative solution to the problem, and it also gives you the fun opportunity to play around with mark making on top of a watercolor wash. I think that I like this snail the best, and then I also feel like the one in the top right corner, that grumpy butterfly, was probably the most challenging, but I want to know from you, which one of these is your favorite? Now we'll put all these supplies and techniques together to create a painting of a betta fish. I start with a very loose gestural sketch that focuses on the movement of the fish, and I pay attention to proportions too, but the movement is definitely the most important part. Now it's time to paint. Leaf green out of the dropper was a little bit too intense, so I added some magenta and I used that earthy green to paint the background. I'm very careful around the edges of my fins, and I try to keep my mark really loose and gestural as I go around the edge, so it doesn't feel like a cutout as much as it might if I just like really tightly outlined everything. Once that earthy green is in the background, I let it dry completely, and then I mix up a wash of violet. Now this isn't pure violet. At this point, my palette has gotten really messy, and I've got some leaf green and magenta in here, quite a bit of magenta actually, because it's a very warm violet, and I'm using this to start mapping in the movement of the fins and the tail. And I want there to be a lot of movement because that's really what this piece is about for me. So I'm being very gestural with my mark. I start with medium pressure, and then I just lift it off very subtly, and I change the mark as I move into the body of the fish. I now have a speckling approach, and I just press, press, press. Once everything is dry, again, I'm coming in with the brown colored pencil and I'm refining and I'm adjusting and adapting. This allows the painting to be really integrated throughout the entire process. I draw and I paint, I draw and I paint. With my next layer, I'm coming in with a more pure violet right out of the dropper, and I'm adding in those shadow shapes, still paying really close attention to movement. There aren't any rules on what colors need to go first, but I would recommend that you work from light to dark and that you are very conscientious of how much water you're using. Here I am using a lot of water mixed in with magenta, and also I've got magenta plus leaf green here, and when I add a lot of water, it is making the layer layer underneath be more reactive. And this gives it a more ethereal, fuzzy look if that's not what you're going for. Rather than doing overall uniform washes, just work in light layers of those gestural marks. Here I'm coming in with a tint, and I've got white plus a little bit of the magenta and a tiny bit of violet too. So I've got this nice warm lavender color, and I'm working very strategically to add the brightest, lightest colors in the area that I want the viewer to focus. So I've got a lot in those front fins and in the body, and I'm working in layers here as well. The body of the white paint is different. It's thicker, and so you are going to have a little bit more control over this paint. This is a great material to use to correct mistakes and to clean up areas that might have gotten out of control with your liquid watercolor. Once I had the tints in, I came in and reactivated the background, pulling the paint away with a paper towel. This gives it a bubble look in the background and keeps it from being too flat. What I love about a mixed media approach is that I don't have to have everything figured out with my paint. I can come in and refine and correct with my drawing materials as much as I need to, and that's exactly what I'm doing with the colored pencil and eventually the fine liner. I make sure to incorporate both of these drawing materials in the background and the foreground so that everything feels like it's related and it belongs together. And now this piece is complete. I hope you learned a ton about watercolor technique and mark making, and we can't wait to see what you create. So be sure to use the hashtag SketchboxFebruary when you post your work online. For more unboxing videos and tutorials, you can head over to our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.